My name is Tamir Rosenblum, and I've been participating in the alternative banking meetings for a year now, and I'm a union side labor lawyer for my day job in New York City.
And today we're going to talk about Chapter 8. Chapter 8 starts with a quote from Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman, that was the hero for Reagan and Thatcher, two of the main characters that got us into this mess in the first place. Why start a chapter with him?
Well, I think the reason we did that was because Milton Friedman is really sort of almost the prophet of neoliberal economics, which is in some way, I think, the doctrine that Occupy is, if it has sort of an opposition, that's almost the definition or the token of what its opposition is. And Milton Friedman created that movement, and yet what the quote shows is that even Milton Friedman understood that you need to have rules to a system, that the notion of neoliberal economics, and even that is not that it's just sort of a survival of the fittest, there's no rules, and you should allow corporations to do whatever they want in a deregulated environment, and everything will come out well. But he understood that markets need to be regimented, they have to have rules, you need to have a sense of a system within which people operate. And so I think that what we're trying to say is, if even he understands that should be something that sort of gets put to the side as something that we need to discuss or debate, but the reality is today that we constantly hear no regulation, less regulation, less regulation, there shouldn't be any regulation, and that wasn't even what our most staunch opposition says.
What would be the arguments for deregulation then? You know, I mean, it's so obvious that we need regulating, but why do people adhere to that notion?
Well, I mean, obviously our point in the book is that there should be a notion of what good regulation is. I'm probably not the person to ask to give the other side's best argument, but you know, what we're told is that any form of restriction that we put on corporations is going to cramp their ingenuity, it's going to cause them to behave in ways that we call inefficient, and that the end result is going to be worse for this sort of stupid government having come in and limited their activities. So we're told this, and we're always sort of given this advertisement that efficiency should be our ultimate goal. And I think we all sort of can see from our experience and sort of just intuitively over the last number of years that if you have a system without rules where people can do whatever they want, they're going to accumulate unfair amounts of wealth and privilege for themselves and not share it with a broader population. And that doesn't make sense at all. I mean, then sort of the analogy we begin the book with, which is football, which is something everyone understands and is sort of this quintessentially American game. Having said that, it's a very rule-driven game. There's a sense of what you can do and you can't do. It's not a better game for the fact that we prohibit the lineman from poking the eyes out of the other team. Like, no, there's things that you can't do within a system that nonetheless has room for ingenuity and imagination and creativity and things that can happen that people are interested in. So the notion of this book is to try to start asking ourselves, leave aside the question of whether regulation is good, regulation is bad. We need to all acknowledge we need regulation, and let's start asking some of the questions of what almost aesthetically are good regulations going to look like, and get away from the issue of whether there should be regulations in the first place or not.
And what kind of regulations should we have? In this chapter, you guys offer some kind of framework for regulatory reforms. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
So sure. So there's a number of sort of broad picture principles we tried to establish and talk about in terms of what are the kinds of things that good regulations look like. Again, getting away from the notion of just talking about whether there should be any or not. So, for example, we talk about the notions that you have to have some level of sort of responsibility and accountability that's just built into a regulation. It can't all just be sort of regimented in the sense that you shall do this in this point and you shall do that at that point, but that you're going to have some sort of just norms of behavior that the regulation has to pick up. So, for example, in the context of finance, there's a striking absence of notions of fiduciary obligations that brokers have toward their clients, which you would expect. They exist for trustees, they exist for lawyers. We almost come to think, well, people who are managing our money must have that kind of just general norm of behavior that gets applied by the law. Ridiculously, it doesn't exist in the current regulatory framework. And so one thing that we talk about, it's really sort of a more substantive direct policy proposal, is that you need to have those sort of norms of behaviors. It can't just be a norm of behavior, which we sort of saw in the lead up to the crisis, of anything that makes me money is a good thing because I'm in the game to make money. No, there needs to be rules and standards about how one goes about making money. We do that in all other areas of professional conduct practically, and it needs to apply in finance as well.
So you said fiduciary obligation. Exactly what is that? What is it?
So fiduciary obligations are sort of a principle. I couldn't even tell you historically how far back it goes, but that it's a notion that when you're serving as a professional for a client, that your duty is entirely to the client, that you're not furthering your own self-interest, or the extent that you're self-interested in the project. It's simply derivative from your client's well-being. So if you're a trustee for money, then you owe a fiduciary obligation to the participants. Suppose that you were managing a pension fund. There's an established fiduciary obligation, or any decision you make with respect to that money has to advance the interests of the retirees, who would ultimately benefit from the accumulation of money in the account. It's a well-defined principle of law. I imagine it goes back to England and common law. So we know what we're talking about. There's a cultural development of this norm. Remarkably, we don't apply it in situations of regular money management. So when you're in situations where Goldman Sachs is pitching different products to its clients at the same time as it is betting against those same products through other alternative instruments, hoping that those same products that they're selling on the one hand will fail and they'll make money from shorting those products in other scenarios. This would be totally inconceivable and inconsistent with a fiduciary obligation that we, again, know what that consists of from having applied it to various other professional endeavors for hundreds of years.
So in other words, it's a notion that whatever it is that you're doing in the financial world, it has to benefit the public. It has to be in the best interest.
Or even for your client. I mean, I think that we're talking about something that's almost more limited than that. It's not that we're saying that Goldman Sachs has to act like some sort of charitable organization and just act for the public. But what we found, that so much of what happened in the lead up to the crisis is that these financial institutions were cheating their clients. It wasn't just that they weren't doing something in a more generic public interest. It's that they were selling loans that were predatory, that were totally not in the interest of the sort of under-income, lower wealth status people who were buying them, getting into them, and they had no obligation to actually look out for the interest of the client, let alone the public at large. Likewise, when Goldman Sachs is peddling all kinds of products to pension funds, claiming that these mortgage-backed securities are good for them at the same time as they're betting against them in another situation, clearly they're not acting in the best interest, not only of the public, but of their individual client.
In a large part, it also is... it's up to us to enforce that, but we see to them, you say in the chapter, there has to be a change in culture. Like, there seems to be this culture that, like, they're rooting for them to do these things almost, like they're the heroes or they're the winners or something.
And I think, well, going back to the notion of enforcement, I think is something we also try to talk about, is that I think we've all rightly become so cynical about any rule that we would create that it would become distorted by the political pressures that come to bear on the regulators and the interests of the regulators in turning around and becoming wealthy by going and then subsequently working for all these entities that they at one point regulate. And so we, going to create that culture, have some very, we think strong suggestions about how you might get away from those sort of dynamics. Sheila Bair, the former head of the FDIC, has talked about really having a very strong, even a bar, on regulators going back in through the revolving door to work for the entities that they once regulated. Again, goes to moving away from a culture where the people who are enforcing the rules sort of have an incentive to not really enforce them because they want to be in good favor with the very entities that they're supposed to be regulating, because the real anticipation is ultimately to go make a lot of money by working for them. Likewise, when we see that the legislative process itself is so imbalanced because the way the rules get made is through this lobbying process where I think there's some statistic that the financial industry hires 5 lobbyists, basically on average, for every single federal congressman or senator, which is, you don't have sort of the counterbalancing public voice is almost completely absent in that kind of scenario. Most people probably couldn't even name what the sort of public interest advocacy group is for these kind of financial issues. One proposal we have is, in order to bring back a culture where our governmental representatives are totally beholden to these interests, that you have some kind of mechanism where people the tax system will fund, in fact, popular voices for issues like this, so that you will have a public interest group that gets a level of government funding to be a voice to counteract the voices that are so definitely one-sided and overwhelming in issues like finance. I mean, if you think about it, we can all easily name, even if we view them as weaker than the industry lobbies, what the big environmental groups are, what the big union groups are. But, Ralph Nader is probably the only consumer advocate most people can name, and he's covering all consumer advocacy. There are some great groups, Better Markets, Occupy the SEC, that have done work in the financial industry, and this is a great thing, but it is so unbalanced at the moment, and we think we need to have some real structural change in how we get voices heard in Congress.
Right. You guys talked, as an example, you brought up the labor scandal again. And there was this interesting thing, the notion of the rational actor model in the business schools. Basically, the people that were part of the labor scandal, they just applied that model. And this goes back to changing the culture.
Right, so what happens in the LIBOR scandal, and now there's additional market manipulation scandals that we're hearing about in terms of just international exchange of currency generally, where you have individual traders who are actually making a profit solely based on their success as an individual trader in terms of making money for the firm, which in turn they're going to get a robust cut of. And all they're doing, they don't even have an interest in their employer as a whole. They're not interested in just Chase succeeding. So Chase has all of these individuals that it views it's going to just act, by acting in their own best interest, is going to benefit Chase, or is going to benefit whatever other big bank is engaging in trading, and it creates this incentive for the individual actors to collaborate, to manipulate markets, to show big profits, even though they're overtly engaging in illegalities that ultimately their employer will pay the penalty for, because we've seen that there's almost no criminal prosecutions that come out of these enterprises. And yeah, that whole notion that the way these organizations are structured, that they aren't causing their own employees to be accountable back even to the organization's best interest, but are just totally driven by their own self-interest, it fails even for their own benefit, because what they end up with is these horrible scandals that they presumably weren't anticipating when they're giving this charge to the individual trader to just be solely focused on his own best interest and making as much money as he can.
Right, and apparently this is taught in business schools through the rational actor model.
Well, I think, right, sort of neoliberal economics, neoclassical economics very much has this view of our society as the best way to get a just outcome is to have everybody just behaving in a totally self-interested way, and somehow through some miraculous invisible hand or some magic that happens, all of us will play out in a way that will get some really great things done. I think we all know in our hearts, and I think we need to start talking about it as a matter of theory, that that's just not what it means to be a good society. That what really creates sort of the fabric of a society is not all of us just acting totally individually and selfishly, but it is the acts that we engage in that are altruistic, that look out for other people, that have concerns for whether it's an employer, whether it's a client, whether it's a society as a whole that is beyond ourselves, that makes it a society worth living in. And to the extent that we are literally teaching people that the way you succeed in life is by being an individual actor that only cares about himself, and this is the virtuous life, it is so perverted as to be just, a 5-year-old should be able to tell us that this is false.
Right, because if you look at the world at large now, like, I do media, and like every day we have reports of gigantic uprisings all over the world, and those are a result of austerity measures, and those austerity measures are a result of neoliberal policies. So when are people going to realize that these policies don't work? I mean, I guess all these uprisings, those people realize it, but the people that are behind those policies, they create complete chaos and revolutions. Where's that going to end?
This is going to be on the chapter we're talking about, and we had the answer to that. We'd have figured out something really amazing. I think that our view is that there's a certain logic that's taught to us, whether it's through business schools, whether it's through Fox News, whether it's really even just from NPR, that there's a sense that we're all working in a basically functioning system, and that it's up to each of us to succeed in the system. To the extent that we fail, it's our own fault, and we shouldn't do anything to complain about it. And the reality is that we're working within a system that is very rigged and has the rules that have been developed by people who are winning from the application of those rules, and that it's essential as it's the first step for people to take a step back from what they've understood about the system and learn better how it functions. That's what the idea of the book is. We're hoping to do other things that sort of enable people to take a step back and understand the system, understand that if they're failing in the system, it's not something that the rational actor school tells them that it's all their fault because they haven't been rational, they haven't been adequately motivated to be self-interested, but they're working within a system that is really not designed for them to succeed. And hopefully this is a first step toward doing that. There's a lot of work to be done, and if people are concerned, we hope they get involved with us or some other group and try to promote that process.
Thank you.